There's also something alluring about Prussia. There's something in the same sort of way that the Greeks looked at Sparta with admiration. There's a kind of admiration about Prussia as well, like this military state that has, supreme discipline, an amazing army, and with very limited resources can essentially, wow Europe, wow great powers with its skill. And so Sparta, it's kind of like, the Sparta of, it's 18th century Europe, right? And there's something about it that makes its leaders interesting in and of themselves. Because, to be a king, one of the things before we started, I find fascinating about this. This is before nationalism is a political ideology, or a sort of concrete political ideology. And that's why we're talking about the succession of royal houses. The people of a place owe loyalty to a king or to a duke or to whatever. And so Britain feels like a weird outside place to this kind of politics, because of course Britain is a national state. We still have the monarch, but we still have the concept of Britain as a national state. Whereas, is that the same here? It's hard to say, right? It doesn't feel. This feels like an older style of politics, actually, if anything. But yeah, so there's just it's a very interesting world. But the thing I'm trying to highlight is how different it is to where we are now. Like, people just think differently about all of these things, and we don't realize it. Like the concepts of honor. Duels are fought in this day and age. We just can't even imagine risking your life for your honor. Like, these are the sort of people that we're dealing with. So.
It's true. It is a very different world in all sorts of ways. So something to say then, just first of all, to kick off, a few words about Prussia. So, if you know anything about 19th or even 20th century history, Prussia is almost a byword for military excellence.
Yeah.
That's what that is. Okay. And it starts with Frederick's father. Frederick William, his father, Frederick I, who was seemingly obsessed with drilling his infantry, specifically his infantry, to just make them almost like robots.
The thing is, whenever I'm playing a strategy game, I'm an infantryman. I love my heavy infantry, and so I'm just hearing this and being like, yeah, well, I'd do the same if I were in his position. Having the best infantry, because it's the infantry that really holds the battle. So
quite often, they win the day multiple times in this story, let alone going forward. One example, when the Japanese were forced to open up to the rest of the world in the 19th century, and they decided they were just going to reform themselves, take everything that's best about the West. Well, they decided just to copy the Prussian model for their army and copy the British model for their navy.
Makes
so
sense.
In other words, sort of kind of obviously the best army is the Prussian army.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but to mention now, where this story starts, that's not the case. His father has spent a generation nearly drilling his infantry, but only the infantry. We'll get into how the cavalry isn't quite up to snuff yet, and it's Frederick II who does that. We'll get into how, when this story starts, no one thinks of Prussia as being this amazing military force. And it's in this story, the War of the Austrian Succession, where everyone sort of realises. Sometimes at school there'll be a kid, and like in the space, this literally happened a few times at my school. There's some kid that people pick on and don't really think anything of. You'll have like 2 or 3 fights in the space for a couple of weeks, and suddenly everyone just reappraises him. It's like, actually, you don't mess with that kid.
Suddenly he's the tough guy, yeah.
So, yeah, not necessarily tough, but just, you don't mess with him anymore, at least. He's not someone you can just pick on.
Yeah.
This is what Prussia goes through at this point. They go from just another one of the principalities, kingdoms in the Holy Roman Empire to, they're absolutely a power in their own right. Okay, they absolutely need to be taken seriously for themselves, sort of 100%. That's what happens in this story.
It might be worth going through a quick history of Prussia, because it's a complex place that's not normal in the European experience. So as I recall, Prussia is the consequence of the sort of crusading fervor of the Teutonic Knights, essentially genociding large parts of sort of Slavic northeastern Europe, and setting up a sort of German ruling class over it. And this morphs into this militaristic state over the course of a few hundred years, and then turns into, because Prussia is what the Baltic tribe, the Slavic tribe, the Prussians were called, and so it's inherited this name, and so it is not in a very advantageous position. It has very little in the way of actual, natural resources or defensible borders. It's essentially on its own, and it's can be invaded from basically any direction.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. So Prussia is one of the bigger members of the Holy Roman Empire. So the Holy Roman Empire is sort of absolutely led by the crown of Austria and Hungary, the dual crown. And that's sort of the biggest, most prosperous, most populous bit. And the other big players are sort of Saxony, Bohemia, Bavaria, Prussia, Hanover, and then there's loads and loads, dozens of little ones. But of the bigger ones, other than Austria itself, Prussia is among the biggest ones, but it's still, you would say it's sort of third or fourth maybe on the list, fifth maybe on the list. One of the main things about it, and it's centered around Berlin. Berlin is its capital. So in a sense, it's sort of ultra-German. There's this idea sort of, what is the most German thing? Is it sort of Bavaria around Munich, or is it more sort of Berlin or Potsdam?
Wow.
So the two biggest cities in Prussia were, at this point anyway, Berlin and Potsdam. So it's very much sort of Eastern Germany. What in the 20th century, second half of the 20th century, was East Germany. So Northeast Germany is what it is.
So what I find interesting about this is AJP Taylor on the course of German history said, look, Germany didn't have to be what it became. It was the Prussians defeating Napoleon, he thinks, that prevented liberalism from really taking root in Germany. And so the sort of Prussian ethos of absolutism became like Germanness, became synonymized with Germanness after the defeat of Napoleon, who represented a foreign conquering ideology. And that's AJP Taylor. So I don't know, but honestly, it sounds like there's something to it to me, because there is underneath like the sort of authoritarian German mindset, this kind of wholesome rural German attitude where it's just they're a lot more like us actually in like the villages, right? But then when you get to the sort of officialdom, you can feel the Prussianness about them, and it's just like there's something about it I don't like. I like the rural Germans.
So Frederick the Great and his father were sort of absolute electors. Well, they called themselves electors. So you've got sort of the Elector of Hanover, the Elector of Bavaria, the Elector of Prussia, which means they've got an electoral vote when it comes to voting for the Holy Roman Emperor.
Yes.
But they were absolute monarchs.
It's a very exclusive kind of democracy.
Yeah. They did rule as autocrat.
Yeah.
The other thing to say, one of the main things to say about Prussia at this point, is that it had its various lands. They're all up and around Berlin and Potsdam in what is sort of northeastern Germany, but they were a bit scattered and broken up. They had other lands between them, lands that belonged to Poland. So there was a Lithuanian-Polish Commonwealth.
Which was huge.
And I'll put a map up and you can see that's giant.
We should do a whole epoch on that at some point.
Well, yeah, just before this, there was the War of the Polish Succession, which is a bit of a smaller affair. And I didn't think it was worth doing a whole Epochs episode on it. But yeah, that was a whole thing.
We should just do it on Poland and Lithuania, because it's fascinating that at some point it's bigger than France, and it's
giant, yeah.
And it has a tiny army.
So just to say then, super quick on that, quick aside on that, is that at this point, the Elector of Saxony is king of Lithuania, Poland at this point.
Right.
And it's giant. And shortly after this, well, not shortly after, actually, a few decades after this, I think actually it's after the 7 Years' War.
Yeah, shortly after the time span.
Sorry?
The relative time span.
Yeah. After the 7 Years' War, Prussia, Austria, and Russia basically carve up Poland, Lithuania. So after World War I, when Woodrow Wilson sort of insisted that they recreate Poland, it didn't come out of nowhere.
No.
It goes back to sort of medieval times.
Yeah.
Anyway, at this point, basically Saxony control Lithuania, Poland. And so, yeah, it's something like a buffer zone between Russia and Central Europe.
But what we're saying is
so
the sort of east of Europe is very complicated and very old and drenched in blood.
So there's a big bit, the main bit of Prussia at this point, again, which contains Berlin and Potsdam and stuff. There's a big part of what they called Royal Prussia in between that and other holdings even further east, up and around where Danzig is, which was a problem even into the 20th century. So one of the main goals for Frederick is to unite his lands, to conquer various bits of land to make Prussia all one continuous thing. And they also used to, long before this, control certain bits of Silesia. And again, I'll put up a map, so most people might not know exactly where Silesia is. But that's sort of one of the main crux of the War of the Austrian Succession. The War of the Austrian Succession is like the War of the Spanish Succession, an overall, a coverall umbrella term, which actually includes lots and lots of different wars, like the 7 Years' War. Within the War of the Austrian Succession are lots of other wars, like the War of Jenkins' Ear. That's us and Spain going at each other's throats a year before the War of the Austrian Succession kicks off. There's 2 Silesian wars are involved in part of the War of the Austrian Succession. So although lots goes on, arguably you could probably say one of the main things, one of the most important things is the showdown between Prussia and Frederick the Great, and the Habsburgs, Austrian, sometime Holy Roman Emperors, against each other for control of Silesia.
Right. So
Silesia is quite a big bit of land. It's about a third of the size of England, sort of a big chunk of sort of Eastern Europe. It's really populous, like over 1 million people. And it had, at that point, one of the highest levels of quote-unquote industrialization. So it was a real prize. Arguably, the richest part of the Holy Roman Empire was Silesia. So whoever controlled it, and again, on a map, you can see that if Prussia controlled it, it's sort of a great bouncing off point into Prague and even Vienna. And if the Austrians control it, it sort of pushes up into Prussian territory. So it's just really, really important. And parts of it, most of it, had been Prussian in the past, but was now Austrian. And, so Frederick the Great sort of coveted it. But his father, Frederick the I, a quick few words about him and Frederick the Great's childhood. Because Frederick the Great, we've got to get into a little bit about his actual personality. You know, it's someone like Alexander or Caesar or Henry V or something. You should sort of need to know a little bit about the actual man himself. And he was a bit complicated because although he's sort of this great martial leader, a great leader of men, a great general king type person, he was also really cultured, a bit fey, maybe gay. I mean, he had a wife and stuff, but also seems to have been, that Alexander type gay, where he was into marching men and military things, but also liked boys. I mean,
I'm just thinking, yet another gay of representation on the distant right.
Yeah, but it seems like he sort of was. Although it was never sort of proven in his lifetime. Although his father just openly called him a sodomite and stuff. And his younger brother Henry was, I think, fairly openly gay. And he was, but like I say, he was married, and so
politically he was married. Yeah.
And but he liked to sort of surround himself by men all the time and commission paintings of scantily clad men from the ancient world and all that sort of thing. It's all a bit.
Is he the one who had the giant bodyguard?
I don't know, probably.
Because there was one who literally got like 6'5" guys to be his bodyguard. I can't remember who it was.
Oh,
I assumed it was Frederick the Great. But
it might have been. I know that one of the Russian Tsars, I think Tsar Paul I, Catherine the Great's son, I think he did that.
Oh, is that him?
I think more than one person would have done that. That's a classic thing, isn't it? Caligula did that.
Yeah, you want huge dudes around you to protect you, right? Yeah. So I just assumed that Frederick the Great had done it. And when you say, oh, he had a fondness for men, it's like, wow.
It'd quite often be a thing that grenadiers, you'd want the tallest men to be grenadiers, for example. So that was totally a thing in the 18th and 19th centuries, that depending on what your role was in the army, kind of depended on how big you were. If you was a skirmisher, it didn't really matter, or could be small.
In fact, it's probably advantageous.
Yeah, to be a cavalryman might be better to be small, because just like horses have got a weight limit. The smaller you are, like a jockey, the smaller you are, the better in a way.
People don't realise that horses, only a few hundred years ago, were actually a lot smaller than horses now as well. Like, they're not giant steeds like you see on TV now.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.